4. The next morning, Georgie was not able to eat his breakfast. Timothy noticed after a time that Georgie's food was untouched and that his eyes had a tired look in them. "I guess you don't feel so good, huh, Georgie?" he asked as they walked away from the breakfast table together. "I feel okay," Georgie answered. He knew he didn't feel okay, but he also knew that he didn't want to talk about his tiredness or his headache. He had other things to think about that morning. Sister Mary Angela called for him to come to her office in mid-morning. "Georgie, I've been thinking about the rose bush all night. Will you listen to what I am suggesting and try to understand?" A sly plan began to take shape in Georgie's mind. It was not quite a lie, almost, but not quite. And it would get Sister to stop talking about the rose bush until other plans came through. "Yes, Sister," he said meekly, and with so mild a face that she looked relieved. "I've been thinking of so many possibilities for your bush. The entrance to our building at one side of the steps is one place where there is plenty of room and where every visitor would see and admire it." She looked at Georgie hopefully. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Sister Mary Angela continued, even more enthusiastically. "Then, of course, I've wondered why you and Timothy might not cultivate a flower garden together, a big plot to brighten up things in the midst of the boys' vegetable gardens. I'm pretty sure Timothy would be glad to take on such a project. He likes you, Georgie." Georgie nodded slowly, and Sister Mary Angela's eyes smiled at him. "Of course, I like the idea of the bush being right outside your window, but then if you don't, we'll skip that possibility. But there's a very special place I'll give you if you want it. That's beside the statue of the Blessed Mother, out under the garden reins tree in the corner of our lawn. Your rose would look lovely there, Georgie. Red blooms against the white marble. Can't you see them in your mind?" Georgie looked at her with the unblinking look he had given Miss Ames when he lied about losing the book. "I'll have to think about these places, Sister." He made his voice sound as if he agreed with much of what she had said. "Of course, it would be foolish to decide in a rush. Why don't you look around at these places I've suggested? Take your time. The rose bushes waited this long. I guess another day or two won't matter." He saw that Sister Mary Angela looked relieved as he walked with her toward the door of her office. Then he went outside and made his plans for a visit to the house across the street. He waited until afternoon when he saw the lady with the golden braids working in her garden beside a bent little man who, according to Timothy, was old Eddie, Mrs. Harper's gardener. Georgie didn't quite have the courage to face the lady who might scalp a strange boy she discovered in her garden. He decided upon a less dangerous approach. Only that morning he and Timothy had glimpsed a stout brown woman busily wiping down some windows, while an even stouter and younger woman sprawled in one of the lawn chairs and watched. "That's Amanda," Timothy had said, pointing out the younger woman. "She's supposed to be the little boy's nurse, but I don't know. I think the grandfather is more of a nurse than she is. We call her Coca-Cola Amanda because she drinks Cokes all day. That's why she's so fat, I guess." Timothy laughed a little at his own gossip. "The other lady is Rosita. She's the housekeeper, and she's Mexican. Rosita's all right. She bakes cookies for us sometimes." And so Georgie went first to see Rosita that afternoon. She gasped slightly when she opened the kitchen door and saw Georgie with his rosebush. "My goodness, little boy, whatever happened to you?" she asked. Then she noticed the rosebush, and her white teeth showed up nicely in her smile. "I don't think we need a rosebush right now," she told him. "Could I talk to the lady that owns this garden?" Georgie asked timidly. Rosita shook her head. No, I don't think so. Mrs. Harper is very busy, and I'm pretty sure she'd not like it if we bothered her." She stepped inside to a table and came out immediately with an iced cupcake in her hand. "Would you like this?" she asked kindly. Georgie shook his head. "No, I don't feel like eatin'. When do you think I could talk to the lady out in the garden?" Rosita's forehead folded into many wrinkles. I don't know, child. You see, Mrs. Harper lost a boy about your age just a year ago, and she... Rosita shook her head, and her face was sad. She ain't up to talking much to other little boys right now. Georgie didn't move. He stood there, staring up at her, and his stare seemed to make Rosita nervous. Why don't you go around in front to the screened porch? Mr. Collier is out there. He's our little boy's grandfather. Why don't you go around and speak to him? She asked. Georgie had the feeling that she was anxious to be rid of him. As he rounded the corner of the house, Georgie saw beyond the heavy iron gate at the edge of the lawn a sloping path that led down to a lake that lay sparkling like a looking-glass in the sunlight. There were trees here and there on both sides of the path, and halfway down to the lake there was a wide old tree like one he had often looked at in his flower book. Miss Ames told him once that it was a banyan tree, and he was pleased that he remembered the name. When he found the porch, he knocked at the screen door, and a man's pleasant voice asked him to come inside. The voice belonged to a slender old man with silver-gray hair and a beard that matched. He sat on a long chair with his feet stretched out before him and with pillows and books all around him. A small boy with curly blonde hair and blue eyes that somehow looked lost and all alone sat close to the old man's side. Well, are you a peddler, young man? Are you selling rose bushes? The man asked as soon as Georgie stepped inside. Georgie shook his head. I'm not selling it. I just want to plant it in your garden. He noticed a worried look come over the old man's face, much like the look that came on Miss Ames' face when Georgie returned to school after a bad beating. He expected to hear the words so many people said when they looked at him for the first time. What happened? Who hurt you? But the little boy's grandfather didn't ask the words Georgie expected. He seemed to be busy with some thoughts for a minute, then he smiled. I'm afraid there isn't a chance of your planting the rose bush here. This garden belongs to my daughter, and she's very particular about choosing the plants she wants in it. Anyway, shouldn't you plant it somewhere near you so you can tend it? No, it has to be here. This is the right place for it. Maybe you haven't looked far enough. By the way, do you live at the school across the street? I've lived there from yesterday. So, you're a new boy. Do any of the sisters know that you've brought your bush over here? No. Georgie rested his awkward parcel on the terrazzo floor of the porch. Where did you find your bush then? The grandfather asked after a pause. I didn't find it. I had a ticket that won it at a grocery store. It had some numbers on it that made them win the bush to me. Georgie changed the subject suddenly as he became interested in the child resting against the grandfather's side. What's the little boy's name? He asked. His name is actually Robert, but we call him Robin. What is yours? Georgie, but I like Robin better. Yes, it's a nice name for a young child, and little Robin will always be young. What makes you say that? Don't he grow right? The grandfather ran his hand across the child's blonde hair. His face was grave when he looked up at Georgie again. No, Robin doesn't grow as he should. He's 5 years old and he can only say a few words. All the boys over at the school know that, so I think I should tell you too. But we love Robin very much. When he and I meet any of the boys on our walks, they never fail to speak nicely to him. That pleases me very much. Georgie put out his hand and touched Robin's foot gently. Will he learn to read when he goes to school? He asked. No. I can't either. I've been to school, but I ain't ever learned to read. The grandfather turned away from Robin and looked for a long time at his collar. You've been hurt, Georgie. Were you in an accident? Here it was, the same old question that everybody asked of him, and in a minute there would be more, maybe a lot more. No, I just got in a fight with some big kids. It must have been a very bad one. The grandfather, whose name was Hugh Collier, shook his head. I've seen other children hurt the way you are, but their hurts didn't come from school-ground fights. Grown-up people hurt those children. Steve didn't hurt me, Georgie said, and then stopped quickly in sudden fright because he had mentioned that name. Hugh Collier shook his head. No, I suppose not. He looked at Georgie, and there was a frown on his face. Georgie felt uneasy. Finally he said, You going to let me plant my bush here? I'm sorry, Georgie, but I have to say no. There are plenty of other places for your bush. There ain't neither any other place, Georgie interrupted him in sudden fury. You're a dumb old bastard, and you don't know what you're talking about. His voice broke, half sobbing and half screaming. All the same, Georgie, we have to face it. You must find another place for your bush. If we allow you to plant it here, other boys will want to come over and plant everything from sunflowers to cabbages. I don't want to talk to you anymore. Not to nobody. Georgie ran around the house, back toward the school, choking with his tears. Rosita came out on the back porch, and Georgie heard her say, What on earth? But he didn't speak or look at her. At 5 o'clock, he didn't go in for supper, and at 6 he once again did not go to vespers. Timothy found him at dusk, sitting on the street curb facing Mrs. Harper's garden. Timothy was plainly out of patience with him. Gosh, Georgie, don't you try to do the right things here at all? Sister Mary Angela was worried when you didn't come to supper. Last night you didn't meet me where I told you to, and now tonight, he broke off suddenly. Where have you been, Georgie? Just tell me that. I ain't been nowhere, Georgie muttered. You're acting mean, Timothy said, but his voice was for some reason milder. I am mean, and I'm dumb. Leave me alone, will you? Georgie glared at Timothy as he had glared at the gray-haired man across the street. Sure, I'll leave you alone. Timothy shrugged indifferently. But then, lots of kids around here are mean and dumb. I am myself sometimes, he added, and his words sounded proud. Georgie closed his eyes for a few seconds. His head ached worse than ever, and the sore places across his back throbbed. He wanted to crawl into the cool bed where he slept the night before and lie in the dark where no one could see him. He knew that he couldn't, though. There were things he had to do before he could rest comfortably. Does your arm hurt you, Georgie? Timothy asked after a while. No. How did it get hurt? A big kid hit it when we had a fight. He looked at Timothy with dull eyes. I thought Sister told you not to ask questions. Well, don't you want to go inside and get something to eat? Timothy asked, refusing to be angered again. No, I just want to be by myself. He turned his back on Timothy. Why don't you go away? He asked wearily. Timothy finally turned away and walked back toward the entrance of the building. Georgie leaned his head upon his knees and moaned softly in his anguish. When he heard Sister Mary Angela say his name, he thought maybe she was going to scold him, but she didn't. Georgie, you must have something to eat before bedtime. You've hardly touched food all day. I know you feel strange and lonely right now, but you'll feel better soon. Come on, we'll get a glass of milk and some bread and butter from Sister Teresa in the kitchen. No, I don't want nothing to eat. Well, then, we'll get you ready for bed, and I'll leave something on your bedside table. Maybe you'll feel like eating later on. She put her hand lightly on his head and ran her fingers through his hair, flinching as Georgie did, when she suddenly encountered a swollen knot hidden in the thick brown tangle just below his crown. He got to his feet slowly, picking up the bush he had laid beside him. They put it back under his window and walked together into the building and down the long corridor to his room. He allowed her to help him off with his shirt, then he stood stolidly against the wall, trying to hide the wounds on his back. "Nobody can look at my back except in a hospital," he told her grimly. "Go away, I can get ready for bed by myself." The world was black outside his window by the time he was in bed. He lay awake, wide-eyed and frightened at what he knew he must do, but determined and unyielding. When Sister Mary Angela looked in on him as she made her nightly rounds, he closed his eyes and lay unmoving on the pillow. She called to him softly, but when he made no reply, she walked away, closing the door quietly behind her. He waited for a long time, until everything was quiet along the corridor. Then he slid out of bed and stood at the window looking out at the house across the street. Many windows were lighted, and Georgie leaned against his own sill, waiting for the lights to go out and for the time to come when he could safely believe that everyone who might possibly be looking out at the garden was in bed and asleep. Underneath his window, the rose bush leaned crookedly against the wall, wondering perhaps why Georgie was so slow in giving it the bed it needed, in giving it a chance to grow the scarlet roses that the tag tied around it had promised. He hurt at the thought of his bush feeling neglected and unloved. A jet roared across the sky, and Georgie's eyes followed the blinking lights until they were finally lost in the darkness. As he watched the plane grow dimmer in the distance, he thought of the lady in the garden. What if someday she would fly away across the sky, into a place so far away that no one would ever see or hear of her again, leaving her garden for Georgie to look after, leaving the little boy to be his friend, to play with him among the bright flowers and under the trees. He wished desperately that such a thing might happen. Finally, all the lights were out, except for a tiny glow from one of the second-floor windows. Georgie moved cautiously around his bed and opened the door of his room with great care, making no sound. He had learned to move stealthily. For a very long time it had been necessary to make no sound if he were to avoid Steve's hearing him. It had been good training for the project he now had in mind. He walked barefoot down the corridor, breaking into a run on tiptoe as he neared the front door. The locks were simple. A great iron key had to be turned, and then a sliding bolt could be moved back easily if one got it in its proper groove. Once the bolt was pressed back, the heavy wooden door opened noiselessly, as if doing its best to cooperate with Georgie, to help him with the thing he had to do. He thought suddenly of the unlocked door at the entrance to the apartment in Tampa, and the memory, together with the blackness of the night into which he stepped, sent a spasm of fear through his body. He trembled as he thought of Steve stepping out of the shadows, grabbing him and throwing him to the ground. He stumbled at the thought and fell on the steps, where he lay for a while gasping with fear. Then, finally, reassured by the silence around him, he crept around the building until he found the rose bush underneath his window. "I didn't forget you. I didn't. He repeated the words in a whisper over and over again as he tugged at the bush with his free hand. Then, pulling it beside him, he crossed the street and opened the gate that led into the garden. The latch clicked as the gate swung back into place, and Georgie cowered for a while, waiting to see if anyone had heard. He needed a spade badly, but there was none to be had, and so, with his hand, he dug into the damp, sandy soil until he made a hole which he hoped was deep enough to take care of the long roots that must be covered. He did not know where to find water, but that was a matter for tomorrow, and for the time being he pushed all tomorrows out of his mind. Tonight there was only one thing that really mattered. The rose bush was at last in the place that was right for it. He stole back to the school's front door just as the bell in the tower chimed 11 times. Once inside, he turned the key carefully and slid the bolt in place as securely as Sister Mary Angela had done when she locked up for the night. Back in his room, he noticed that the world rocked all about him. When he climbed into bed, he clutched at the sides of his mattress for support until the beating of his heart quieted and he was able to sleep.